Good morning, friends, colleagues, and esteemed guests. Brayden, Pelham, Erica, Steele, Victoria Kerr, and I are pleased to firstly acknowledge the Indigenous peoples' lands which we are on today. We as a team are collectively fortunate to be living on the unceded and traditional lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Esquimalt, and Songhees First Nations territories. I would also like to encourage everyone present today to reflect on where it is we each call home, and to understand the importance of its cultural heritage. This is to become more present and reaffirm our commitment towards reconciliation and self-awareness by giving thanks, showing respect, and honoring the peoples and traditions of these lands. We would like to thank Chief Administrative Officer of the alts'ap Village Government, Andrew Robinson, and Council Clerk Crystal Bright for being our primary contacts for this project. It has been a pleasure working alongside you throughout this academic year. A profound sense of thanks also goes to Andrea Reimer, our faculty lead, for incredible support and guidance. And lastly, to Professor Julian Dirks and Learning Coordinator Corinne Bulmer. Thank you both for your invaluable guidance throughout both terms. Without further ado, our global policy project speaks on the assessment of sea level rise and adaptation strategies for the Nisga'a Village Government of alts'ap.
Located in northwestern BC, within the Nisga'a Nation, the alts'ap village lies approximately 24 kilometers from the mouth of the Nass River. The village is home to roughly 600 residents who are educated in and practice Nisga'a traditions. The issue of concern that this community faces is that climate change threatens alts'ap village lands with flooding as water levels rise in the Nass River. As a small community, alts'ap lacks the financing capabilities to effectively resist sea level rise. As a result, the community faces limited options on how to adapt. The village is seeking recommendations on how to implement proactive climate adaptation strategies that will best meet the needs of the residents.
This map of the alts'ap village depicts in red the estimated impact of what a 50-year sea level rise will have on its community and infrastructure. So based off of our understanding of this issue, the questions that we wanted to address when we beginning this project were: how have adaptation instruments and strategies been effectively prioritized and utilized in other parts of the world that would be effective for flood adaptation within the alts'ap village lands? And the second question asked: how then can the community of alts'ap prioritize their criteria in their approach towards sea level rise adaptation?
So we created this infographic as a visual representation of our project. Essentially, we took a look at what communities around the world have done when adapting to sea level rise and flooding. From the available literature that we read, we were able to break adaptation strategies down into four main approaches. These are to prepare, protect, adjust, and avoid. We're going to dive a bit deeper into what these all mean, but just broadly, the concepts are quite simple. Community can prepare for flooding and formulate a strategy before a flood occurs. They can stay where they are and protect the homes and infrastructure from damages. They can adjust their homes and infrastructure by building back or elevating, or they can avoid flooding altogether by moving away. Of course, many communities use several aspects and variations of these strategies. And while the success of a community's adaptation strategy is determined by the rights holders and stakeholders within the community, in most cases, adaptation strategies that were deemed successful typically heavily integrated aspects of the prepare approach.
Preparation requires involving and engaging the community about sea level rise and flooding risks at an early stage. It also involves risk assessments, floodplain mapping, emergency planning, and cost-benefit analyses of potential projects. It was very clear throughout our literature review that communities who were more engaged and involved in the adaptation process often led to more concise and effective adaptation strategies. It is also important to recognize that poor planning can lead to ineffective, inequitable, environmental, and socially unsustainable results. In some cases, poor coordination and planning efforts lead to uncontrolled expansion in high-risk areas, which consequently leads to a lack of infrastructure and a failure to expand and maintain existing drainage systems, greatly increasing the severity and frequency of flood damages. It should be noted, of course, that alts'ap is already a good example of a community that has proactively begun preparing for potential sea level rise flooding, which is why this conversation is happening now.
Naturally, residents that live within a floodplain often would like to see their properties protected rather than move or to make major preventative restorations to their properties. This can be done through several measures, most commonly through hard armoring like dikes and seawalls. While this may seem like the most effective way to prevent flooding and satisfy waterfront landowners, there are a number of reasons why protection may not be the most ideal strategy. On top of extensive construction and maintenance costs, there are several negative environmental effects from dikes and seawalls. Moreover, protection often offers a false sense of security, which would further encourage density closer to the shore. If for any reason flooding does occur, even with protection, that false sense of security greatly increases damages. Other communities have opted for soft armoring tactics like shore revitalization and naturalization or beach nourishment. This is essentially allowing for a naturalized shoreline buffer between the water and housing. These options, which have become a preferred practice within Vancouver, provide similar protections against flooding with significantly less upfront and maintenance costs.
Adjustments through zoning and regulation can be used to raise, set back, or adapt homes and infrastructure so that they are flood resistant. Zoning is a tool that policymakers favor because it can limit economic vulnerability to flooding and also generally allows residents to retain their properties. It can be used to establish appropriate minimum building setbacks and minimum elevations. Density zoning can also be used to reduce populations within a flood zone while encouraging greater density at higher elevations. Regulations can be used to accommodate for sea level rise or to facilitate a slow managed retreat. Subdivision regulation and development permits require pre-approval for subdivisions, divisions of land for sale, or any further construction. This pre-approval must be obtained prior to any development on land that has been deemed at risk of flooding. Subdivision regulation and development permits serve to limit further construction and keeps population density within floodplains to a minimum. Examples of these can be seen in Surrey, BC, and its development permit area for protection of development from flood-related hazards, as well as in its new floodplain bylaw. A third method of adjustment is building regulations, which can be used to promote the adoption of more resilient building types, such as raised or reinforced structures. These can also include development and building restrictions that disincentivize living within a floodplain. One example of restrictive regulations followed the 2011 earthquake along the coast in Honshu, where the Japanese government chose to prohibit the reconstruction of damaged properties and listed several small villages as off limits for residential use.
The final approach we identified is avoid. This involves communities or individual houses choosing to completely relocate to avoid damages from sea level rise. This can be accomplished through land acquisition, land swaps, easements and covenants, or land trusts. Land acquisition is voluntary surrender or sale of land from the landowner to the government in order to avoid damages resulting from sea level rise flooding. This is an effective long-term method to completely relocate a population, but there are potential challenges like flooding, high costs, societal damages, long time frames, and administrative costs. This was successfully implemented in the province of Quebec when the provincial government offered to buy out flood-damaged homes in Bas-Saint-Laurent and sell them back to the municipality for $1, so affected residents could use the funds to relocate. Another way to avoid is through land swaps. Land that is considered at risk can be transferred from one site to another of equal value. This can be harder for smaller communities to implement, but is more cost effective. In the US, the Climate Resilience Grant offered the coastal Native American community of Ile de Jean Charles $48 million to relocate the community. An additional means of avoid is possible through easements and covenants. Easements allow for an agreement between two parties that restrict or limit the way land can be used without changing ownership. Development on land may be restricted for conservation or for protection against sea level rise. Conservation or restrictive covenants can restrict owners from constructing hard armoring defenses against sea level rise as a way to preserve the shoreline or as a way to encourage retreat. Canada has yet to utilize easements and covenants, but New England states in the US have limited the ability to protect and develop homes, allowing for natural migration of ecosystems inland. A final way to avoid is through land trusts. This refers to the sale of land at risk of flooding to an environmental conservation nonprofit. This option is dependent on finding a buyer, but it has been an effective strategy for communities in the past. The Nature Trust of BC acquired 76.7 hectares of land from residents of Parksville on Vancouver Island, allowing for wetland restoration through prohibiting development, ultimately preventing flood damage from sea level rise along the Englishman River estuary.
Our research has 6 main findings. The first finding is that successful strategies involve the development of a framework with extensive stakeholder and rights holder input, where community members are educated and aware of all potential strategies. We have found that hard armoring structures is not the most favorable option, as it can encourage density near water, increase the risk of damages, further environmental degradation, and it can be costly to both develop and maintain. We have also found that the majority of communities with successful sea level rise adaptation responses use several strategies rather than just one. Although an avoidance strategy of managed retreat was found to be the most effective long-term solution to sea level rise, relocation can have significant social and economic impacts. Finally, we found that various funding options are available to Canadian communities should they require financial support for responding to sea level rise.
So we suggest that alts'ap implement a formal framework for a sea level rise avoidance strategy through the use of land restrictions and regulations. This framework should include a risk assessment, community support and contribution, and a timeline with a clear development plan that involves consultation with the wider community. A land swap option can be offered, allowing landowners to relocate from a high-risk flood zone to a location deemed safer. Additionally, any relocation must be established in designated areas fit to appropriately tend to the needs of those moving through effective sanitation services, utilities, and sound infrastructure. Finally, we recommend applying for available funding to help fund the development of framework and facilitation of these relocation processes.
We'd like to thank you all for joining us today and listening to our presentation. Moving forward, we wish the very best for the alts'ap community and are extremely grateful to have been part of this crucial project. Now we'd like to open up the floor for any questions. Thank you.